Genesis chapter 2 is often treated as a beautiful and poetic explanation of human origins, a softer and more personal story than the grand cosmic picture of chapter 1, but when you actually read it closely, it quickly unravels into contradictions, strange logic, and an outdated view of the world that raises more questions than it answers. The first thing that jumps out is how Genesis 2 doesn't even line up with Genesis 1. In the first chapter, humans are created last, after the plants and animals. In the second, man is formed first, and then plants, then animals, then woman. The order flips entirely. If these two chapters were supposed to be telling the same story, they wouldn't contradict each other right out of the gate. But they do. And the reason is simple. These are two separate traditions, stitched together by later editors. Genesis 2 isn't a continuation of chapter 1. It's an entirely different version of the creation story. Now, let's look at the details. According to Genesis 2, the very first human is formed from dust. God breathes into his nostrils, and just like that, Adam comes to life. But think about how this frames humanity. We aren't part of a larger evolving process or the result of natural forces working over time. We're supposedly handcrafted from dirt in a single act. That view not only conflicts with everything we've learned about biology, but it also reduces humanity to a kind of clay project, stripped of the depth we actually see in human history, culture, and development. The garden setting is equally strange. God plants Eden and puts Adam inside to take care of it. But why would a perfect paradise even need tending? If everything was created flawless, why does Adam have to farm it, even before the concept of toil is introduced? The story tries to set up Eden as a perfect environment, but the details already don't fit together. Then comes the problem of free will. God puts a tree right in the middle of the garden and tells Adam not to eat from it. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, this raises a massive issue. How can Adam be expected to obey a moral command before he even has knowledge of good and evil? That's like punishing a child for not understanding a rule they couldn't possibly grasp. The logic collapses in on itself. And yet, this is the foundation for the entire idea of human sin. Notice also how God only creates Eve after declaring that it's not good for man to be alone. So he brings the animals first, as if Adam might find a suitable partner among them. It's a moment that borders on absurd. Did the story's writers seriously imagine Adam flipping through the animals like a catalog of potential companions, only for none of them to work? The text itself says, "But for Adam, no suitable helper was found." Only then does God create woman from Adam's rib, and that detail is loaded with problems. First, it reduces woman to an afterthought, a secondary creation derived from man instead of equal to him. That set the stage for centuries of patriarchal thinking, the belief that women are dependent, incomplete, or subordinate. Even today, this one image of Eve being formed from Adam's rib is still used in religious circles to justify inequality. It's not a neutral story, it's a deeply influential one, with real-world consequences for half the human population. There's also the glaring issue of population. If humanity begins with just Adam and Eve, what about their children? The story quickly falls into uncomfortable territory. Cain and Abel are born, but who do they marry? Either the text is leaving out essential details, or it's implying incest as the only possibility. And the silence of the narrative speaks volumes. It doesn't even consider how impossible it would be for two individuals to populate the earth without catastrophic inbreeding. And this isn't just a minor oversight, and it shows how the story was never meant to be taken literally. Ancient people weren't worried about genetics or population viability. Their storytelling didn't have to answer those questions because their audience wasn't asking them. But when this story gets treated as history, those holes become impossible to ignore. It's a reminder that the Bible was written in a time before science, and its authors didn't even know the kinds of problems their tales would create when read as literal truth. Beyond the contradictions and ethical issues, Genesis 2 reveals the mindset of the culture that produced it. It reflects a world where men were central, women were seen as secondary, and human existence was explained with simple metaphors. The very idea of forming a man from dust and a woman from a rib isn't just symbolic, it's primitive biology.
from a people who didn't know where babies actually come from beyond the surface level process. That might sound harsh, but it's important to be honest. These were attempts to explain life without real knowledge, and they only made sense in a world without microscopes, medicine, or evolutionary theory. The geography of Eden also reveals its human origin. The text talks about rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, as well as others whose locations are debated. This roots the story in Mesopotamia, where agriculture first flourished. The Garden of Eden wasn't a global paradise. It was the writers looking around at fertile land and imagining it as the place where life began. They weren't describing universal truth. They were embedding their myths in the landscape they knew. Another fascinating detail is how God is described here. In Genesis 1, he's cosmic and distant, creating with words alone. In chapter 2, he's walking, planting, shaping, and breathing. It's an earthy, anthropomorphic picture, almost like a craftsman working with his hands. These two portrayals don't mesh. Unless you're willing to accept that different groups of storytellers had different visions of God, it's impossible to reconcile. And that's the deeper issue. Genesis 2 shows us not one consistent worldview, but multiple overlapping ones, stitched together later into a single text. The editors didn't smooth out the contradictions because their goal wasn't to produce a modern history book. It was to preserve different traditions side by side, even if they didn't perfectly align. That's why Genesis 1 and 2 can't be harmonized without mental gymnastics. They weren't meant to. Even the very setup of the garden creates problems. If God is all-knowing, then he knows Adam and Eve will eventually eat from the forbidden tree. He knows the serpent will tempt them. He knows the fallout before it even happens, and yet he sets it all up anyway. That means either he wanted them to fail, or he created a situation where failure was inevitable. Either way, the story undermines the idea of a fair test of free will. And when people talk about Eden as a perfect paradise, they forget how fragile that paradise really was. One wrong bite of fruit and the entire thing collapses. That's not perfection. That's a trap. The story of the tree also raises another uncomfortable point. Why put such power in something as trivial as eating fruit? If the point was to test obedience, why choose an object tied to knowledge? And more importantly, why deny knowledge in the first place? If knowing good from evil is dangerous, does that mean ignorance was the ideal? That humans were better off unthinking, unquestioning, and obedient? That's what the logic of Genesis 2 seems to suggest, and that mindset has echoed throughout history, where religious authorities often favored blind faith over inquiry. It's also worth noting that the very idea of morality being tied to a single act of disobedience undermines the complexity of human behavior. Real morality is built on empathy, cooperation, and an understanding of consequences, but Genesis reduces it to one arbitrary rule. Don't eat from this tree. The whole moral drama of the universe is framed around a test that wouldn't make sense in any other context. It's as if the story is less about explaining human nature and more about justifying human suffering, and that's the point that often gets overlooked. Genesis 2 isn't just an origin myth, it's a setup for the doctrine of blame. It creates the backdrop where all human pain, all suffering, all struggle can be pinned on that single act of eating fruit. This turns life itself into a punishment. Work becomes toil, childbirth becomes agony, relationships become power struggles, and death becomes inevitable. The story takes natural realities of life and reframes them as divine. Punishment. That twist has affected the way billions of people interpret human existence, but look at it critically. Instead of seeing pain and death as part of the natural order, as things to understand and address through science, medicine, and compassion, this myth taught people to see suffering as deserved, as something humans brought on themselves. That belief has been used time and time again to dismiss hardship instead of solving it. If suffering is a punishment, then why fight it? Why seek cures or challenge injustice? The story itself dulls the impulse to improve the human condition. The role of Eve is particularly striking here.
By placing her creation after Adam and then making her the one who gets deceived, the narrative builds a subtle but powerful message. Woman as derivative, woman as weak, woman as the gateway of sin. This framing wasn't harmless. It laid the groundwork for misogyny embedded in religious traditions for centuries, from sermons that blamed women for the fall of humanity, to laws that treated them as property, to cultures that silenced their voices. This story was always lurking underneath as justification, and it doesn't stop there. Think about how this narrative frames relationships. If woman is created as a helper for man, her existence becomes defined by his needs. Her identity is not independent but secondary. Even the word helper has been twisted to suggest subordination, when in reality, human companionship is supposed to be mutual. Yet in countless religious communities, this one story is still invoked to place men above women, reinforcing hierarchies that have nothing to do with fairness or equality. And when you zoom out, you see just how much baggage Genesis 2 carries. It doesn't just tell a story of beginnings. It encodes a worldview where obedience is valued over understanding, where suffering is punishment rather than reality, where men are primary and women are secondary, and where the natural world is reduced to a backdrop for human drama. These aren't neutral details. They're ideas that shaped how billions of people came to view themselves and each other. Another part of Genesis 2 that often gets glossed over is the portrayal of work. Adam is placed in the garden to work it and take care of it. But wait, wasn't Eden supposed to be paradise? If everything was abundant and perfect, why would cultivation even be necessary? The story ends up smuggling labor into paradise before labor was even supposed to exist as punishment. That small inconsistency reveals how the writers were projecting their own agrarian lifestyle into the myth. For them, farming was central to survival, so even their version of paradise couldn't be imagined without it. This tells us something important. Genesis 2 isn't timeless truth. It's a cultural snapshot. It reflects a world of small-scale farming communities where explaining life in terms of gardens, soil, and rivers made sense. But when people today insist on treating this text as divine revelation, they ignore the very human fingerprints all over it. The details reveal the worldview of the storytellers more than they reveal anything about reality. Then there's the serpent who appears in the next chapter, but whose groundwork is set up in Genesis 2 by the tree itself. The mere presence of the tree of knowledge creates a setup where temptation is inevitable, and that raises questions. If the serpent is evil, why was he allowed in the garden at all? If God is all-powerful, why leave a dangerous being in the same space as two naive humans? The pieces don't fit unless you assume the story was never meant to be airtight, and maybe that's the real problem. Genesis 2 doesn't read like a carefully designed narrative. It reads like folklore, where logic bends to storytelling needs. The order of creation doesn't need to line up, because consistency wasn't the goal. The portrayal of God can shift from cosmic to personal, because myths evolve with different communities. The contradictions only stand out now, because we've been trained to expect coherence from something labeled sacred scripture. But once you let go of that assumption, the story looks exactly like what it is, a patchwork of human attempts to explain life. And not just explain, but control. Because remember, these stories weren't written in a vacuum. They shaped how people understood authority, morality, and gender. And when you tell a whole society that women are second class, because their origin is secondhand, you aren't just entertaining them with a myth, you're laying the groundwork for systemic inequality. Another detail worth noting is the strange intimacy of God's actions here. He breathes into Adam's nostrils, plants trees, and performs a rib surgery. This isn't a distant cosmic force, it's a deity with very human qualities. The God of Genesis 2 looks less like the architect of a universe and more like a magician craftsman tinkering in a workshop. That human-like quality makes sense if the story comes from an ancient culture projecting their own experiences onto their God, but it doesn't make sense if you're claiming this being is eternal, omnipotent, and transcendent. And this leads to another inconsistency. If God wanted to create humanity in the best possible way,
Why start with one man and then improvise from there? Why test animals as companions before deciding a woman might be better? The sequence looks less like divine perfection and more like trial and error. That's not the mark of an all-knowing being, it's the mark of human storytelling. When you read Genesis 2 with fresh eyes, the improvisational feel is hard to miss. First, God makes Adam, then realizes it's not good
for him to be alone, then cycles through animals as potential companions, then finally resorts to creating woman. The sequence has the same rhythm as a folk tale where the storyteller is working through possibilities one by one. It doesn't reflect foreknowledge. It reflects trial, error, and correction. Yet believers are told this is the plan of a perfect, all-knowing God. That's not what the text itself shows. And that rib story isn't just strange. It's symbolic in ways that shaped entire cultures. By making woman come out of man, the hierarchy is built in from the start. Male as the origin, female as derivative, male as primary, female as supporting role. This is not a side note. It's the mythological foundation for thousands of years of patriarchy. Religious leaders didn't need to invent their own justification for subjugating women. Genesis 2 already gave it to them in narrative form. Some will argue that being made from Adam's rib was meant to suggest closeness or equality, that Eve wasn't made from his head to rule over him, nor his feet to be trampled by him, but from his side to be near him. That sounds poetic, but it's wishful thinking layered onto the text. The plain reading is clear. She is formed after him, from him, for him. And that order carried authority in a world where myth dictated reality. This hierarchy becomes even more visible in how later interpretations treat responsibility. When the fall happens, Eve is the one blamed for listening to the serpent, even though Adam also eats. That blame wasn't accidental. It was built into the logic of her secondary creation. If she's derivative, she can also be scapegoated, and for generations women were called the daughters of Eve, inheritors of her weakness and guilt. This isn't just myth, it's the seed of systemic misogyny embedded in scripture. And we can see the fallout historically. Women excluded from priesthoods, barred from leadership, forced into silence in churches, controlled in marriage, denied education, all justified because of one ancient story where a rib became a woman and that woman supposedly failed. The fact that this myth still shapes attitudes today shows how powerful it has been. A single narrative written thousands of years ago continues to influence how millions think about gender. But the problems go beyond gender. They cut into the very concept of morality itself. If obedience to an arbitrary command is the highest virtue, then morality becomes about submission, not understanding. It becomes about fear of punishment, not empathy or justice. That's the kind of thinking that can excuse almost anything as long as it's commanded by authority. And Genesis 2 sets the stage for that mindset by turning human curiosity, the very drive that leads to growth and discovery, into the ultimate transgression. When you think about it, the act of eating from the tree wasn't an act of destruction. It was an act of seeking knowledge, and the punishment wasn't just for breaking a rule, it was for wanting to understand. What message does that send? That enlightenment is dangerous? That ignorance is the ideal? That obedience is more valuable than awareness? Those aren't harmless ideas. They're ideas that have fueled anti-intellectualism, suspicion of science, and suppression of free thought for centuries. The deeper you look, the more Genesis 2 feels less like a divine revelation and more like a cautionary tale against curiosity. The forbidden tree is knowledge itself, and the punishment for eating from it is death. Not instant death, of course, but mortality, suffering, and banishment from paradise. It's a myth that takes the very thing that makes us human, our drive to ask questions, to explore, to learn, and brands it as rebellion. That is one of the most telling signs that this story was crafted by human hands, not divine wisdom, because in reality, knowledge has always been the key to survival, not the cause of downfall. And notice how vague the warning is. You must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die. But Adam and Eve don't drop dead the moment they eat. Instead, they go on living. They even have children. The so-called death is reframed as eventual mortality, which humans already experienced long before any mythical garden. So the command is misleading, almost like setting up a trap with unclear rules. If this story is meant to show divine justice, it fails. It shows trickery, confusion, and disproportionate consequences. The punishment doesn't just affect Adam and Eve either. It's stretched across all humanity. Work becomes exhausting. Childbirth becomes painful. Death becomes inevitable. In other words, every natural part of existence is recast as a curse. Instead of seeing life as what it is, the story says life itself is punishment for disobedience. That flips the perspective completely. Instead of gratitude for being alive, you're supposed to carry guilt for being alive. And that mindset shaped entire civilizations, training people to see themselves as fallen, unworthy, and guilty before they ever made a single choice. This is where psychology comes into play. Teaching people from childhood that they are broken by default creates a self-image of weakness and dependence. It makes them more likely to submit to authority because they're told they can't trust themselves. And it creates cognitive dissonance because on the one hand, humans are described as made in God's image. Yet on the other hand, they're told they're corrupt and deserving of punishment. That contradiction has left countless people struggling with shame and confusion about their own worth, all rooted in this one ancient story. And here's another overlooked detail. If Eden was perfect, then where did the serpent come from? If evil had no place in paradise, how did it sneak in? And if God created everything, then God created the serpent too, which means he either built evil into the system or deliberately allowed it. There's no way around it. The story never explains, and believers have been patching over that gap with interpretations ever since. But the simplest explanation is that the myth itself wasn't written with consistency in mind. It was just a story, and like many stories, it had plot holes. When you connect all these pieces, a pattern emerges. Genesis 2 isn't a coherent moral framework. It's a myth designed to explain why humans suffer, why life is hard, and why men dominate women. It's a story that gave ancient people answers to questions they didn't yet understand, but answers that come at a cost, because when those answers get treated as eternal truth, they distort how people see themselves, each other, and the world. Another striking issue in Genesis 2 is how responsibility is framed. Adam is placed in the garden, given a rule, and told what not to do, but when Eve enters the picture, she receives the rule secondhand through Adam. That detail matters, because when the serpent tempts Eve, the conversation is based on an instruction she never heard directly from God. This raises the question, did she even know the rule as clearly as Adam did? If not, then the entire setup is stacked against her. And yet, when things go wrong, the weight of blame falls on Eve. Religious tradition even coined phrases like Eve's sin or Eve's temptation. She becomes the symbol of weakness, curiosity, and disobedience. This is a deliberate narrative move, whether intentional or not. It shifts accountability away from Adam, the supposed first human who actually heard the rule, and places it on the one who came after. That subtle choice shaped thousands of years of how men and women were viewed differently in moral responsibility. But let's pause and look at the structure. God creates Adam, places him in Eden, gives him a rule, then creates Eve, then allows a serpent to show up, then punishes everyone when things go wrong. If you look at this like a moral drama, it doesn't show divine justice. It shows a setup where failure was inevitable. The test was flawed from the start. And that leads to an even deeper contradiction. If God is truly loving, why build such a fragile system where the first mistake ruins everything? Why place eternal consequences on a single act of disobedience carried out by two people who didn't yet have knowledge of good and evil? No parent would punish their child eternally for touching something they didn't fully understand, but Genesis 2 and 3 portray God doing exactly that. What's fascinating is how this myth shaped the human view of authority. The story conditions people to accept that authority can set arbitrary rules, enforce them with unclear consequences, and punish not just individuals, but their descendants for breaking them. This is injustice, it's authoritarianism disguised as morality, and once this mindset is normalized, it spreads. It trains people to obey leaders, kings, priests, or institutions without question, even when the rules make little sense. That's why Genesis 2 is more than just an old tale. It's the seed of a worldview that prioritizes obedience over reason, hierarchy over equality, and punishment over understanding. And once that seed was planted, it grew into doctrines that shaped law, politics, and culture for centuries. One of the most telling features of Genesis 2 is how it uses simplicity to explain complexity. Instead of grappling with the messy realities of human nature, it reduces everything to a single cause: disobedience. Why do people die? Because of disobedience. Why is life hard? Because of disobedience. Why is childbirth painful? And why do men rule over women? Again, disobedience. It's a catch-all explanation that sounds neat on the surface, but it erases the true complexity of human experience. And this matters because people still carry those explanations forward. Instead of studying disease, suffering was long thought to be punishment. Instead of investigating natural disasters, they were often interpreted as divine wrath. Instead of asking why inequality exists, people were told it was simply the result of a cosmic curse. The myth simplified life into a moral fable, and in doing so, it discouraged people from digging deeper. There's another overlooked issue too: the way the text describes Adam's authority over naming the animals. This isn't just about classification. In the ancient world, naming was tied to power. To name something was to define it, to exercise authority over it. So when Adam names the creatures, the story is reinforcing the idea that humanity has dominion over the natural world. That idea has been incredibly influential and incredibly destructive. It helped create a mindset where nature was seen as existing solely for human use. Forests, rivers, animals, ecosystems, all reframed as resources for people rather than interconnected systems with intrinsic value. This anthropocentric worldview, rooted in Genesis, is one of the reasons religious traditions often resist environmental ethics. If you believe the earth was made for humans, then protecting it becomes secondary. And that logic has real-world consequences. And from centuries of overexploitation of land to dismissing climate change today, the echoes of Genesis still shape how people relate to the planet. And here's another inconsistency worth pointing out. Genesis 1 described creation as orderly, structured, and repeated in a sequence of days. But Genesis 2 abandons that rhythm and tells a completely different story, which raises the question: if these texts came from the same divine source, why such different portrayals? Why can't the account stay consistent even across 2 consecutive chapters? The most straightforward answer is that they didn't come from one source, and they came from different communities, each with their own version of origins, eventually stitched together into one book. The result is that contradictions sit side by side. Man created last in chapter 1, but first in chapter 2. Plants existing before man in chapter 1, but after man in chapter 2. A distant God in chapter 1, but a hands-on gardener in chapter 2. These aren't subtle differences, they're fundamental disagreements. Yet they're both called scripture, and readers are told to treat them as one seamless truth. The irony is that the very act of placing these 2 stories together exposes the human editing behind the Bible. If these were divine revelations, you wouldn't expect contradictions within the opening pages, but if they were human traditions, each with its own perspective, then the contradictions make perfect sense. They're the fingerprints of storytelling, not the mark of perfect revelation. Another curious part of Genesis 2 is the way it treats human relationships. The text says, "A man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." But stop and think about that for a moment. Adam and Eve didn't have parents. There was no father or mother to leave. So who exactly was this rule written for? Clearly not Adam and Eve. It was written for later audiences projecting their own marriage customs back onto the mythical first humans. That small detail is important. It shows that the story wasn't composed as a literal account of human beginnings. It was shaped to reinforce the social norms of the community that told it. Marriage, gender roles, family structure, all encoded into the myth, giving them divine endorsement. And once you claim that God himself established a rule, it becomes harder for people to question it. That's how myths become tools of social control. And this helps explain why Genesis 2 has been so enduring. It doesn't just tell a story of origins, it tells people how to live. Men as leaders, women as helpers, marriage as the core social unit, obedience as the highest virtue. These weren't abstract theological ideas, they were cultural values wrapped in sacred packaging. And when values are tied to divine authority, they carry weight far beyond reason. But again, look at the cost. By presenting these social structures as divinely ordained, the story froze them in place. It discouraged innovation, experimentation, or progress. For thousands of years, people were told that questioning gender roles or family patterns was questioning God himself. That's the power of Genesis 2, not its truth, but its ability to sanctify human traditions. Even the choice of setting a garden reflects cultural ideals. To an agrarian society, the garden was the ultimate symbol of order and abundance. It was nature domesticated, controlled, and fruitful. That's why Eden isn't a wilderness, but a carefully planted space with rivers flowing through it. But in reality, life didn't begin in a tidy garden. Life began in wild, chaotic ecosystems shaped by forces far beyond human control. The garden image isn't a reflection of truth. It's a reflection of human longing for order. And that's what Genesis 2 ultimately is. Not an account of what happened, but an account of what people wished were true. A world where everything has a clear cause, every role has a clear order, every problem has a clear explanation. It's neat, it's simple, it's comforting, but real life is messy, complex, and often without simple answers. The danger comes when people cling to myths that oversimplify reality instead of engaging with reality itself. One of the overlooked aspects of Genesis 2 is how it sets up a framework of exclusivity. Adam and Eve are placed in a garden, isolated from the rest of creation. The implication is that they are unique, different, separate from the rest of life on Earth. But biology tells us the opposite. Humanity is not separate. We're deeply connected to every other form of life. We share DNA with plants, animals, and even microbes. Our bodies are mosaics of evolutionary history, not unique clay figures dropped into a garden. By portraying humans as fundamentally separate, Genesis plants the idea that we stand above nature, not within it. That's a dangerous starting point, because if you see yourself as separate, you don't feel responsible for the ecosystems you depend on. You see them as tools, not partners. That mindset helped justify centuries of exploitation of the natural world. And it all traces back to the myth of human specialness embedded in Genesis 2. Another point that raises eyebrows is how the narrative casually mentions the rivers of Eden, the Tigris, Euphrates, Pishon, and Gihon. Some of these are real rivers known in Mesopotamia, while others are mysterious or lost. This isn't universal geography. It's local geography, tied to the experience of people who lived in that region. It shows that Eden was never meant to be everywhere. It was meant to be their world's beginning. Yet generations later, people treated it as the beginning of all life. That shift from local myth to universal claim is one of the reasons Genesis has had such an outsized influence. A story crafted for one small group became the supposed origin of the entire human race. And because of that, all of humanity was forced into a narrative that wasn't even theirs. That's why so many people still struggle with reconciling science, history, and faith. They're trying to fit global human experience into the mold of a local story from the ancient Near East. There's also the irony of how Eden is presented as a paradise, but contains built-in instability. The forbidden tree, the serpent, the fragile rules. It's paradise on the surface, but a trap underneath. And that tension is key, because if paradise is unstable, then humans can be blamed for losing it. It shifts responsibility for imperfection away from God and onto humanity. It's a clever narrative move, but it's not a fair one. The result is that people grow up believing that imperfection is their fault, that suffering is their fault, that death is their fault, when in reality, imperfection, suffering, and death are simply parts of nature. By blaming humanity, the story absolves God of responsibility and transfers all the weight onto us. And that's not just mythology, that's psychological manipulation. When you step back and look at Genesis 2 as a whole, what you see is not a timeless revelation, but a reflection of ancient fears, values, and limitations. A story written by people trying to make sense of life long before science, long before psychology, long before history as we understand it. They didn't know how humans came to exist, so they told a story about dust and ribs. They didn't know why people suffer, so they told a story about fruit and disobedience. They didn't know how to justify social hierarchies, so they told the story that placed men before women and made women responsible for failure. The real problem isn't that this story exists. The real problem is that it has been elevated far beyond what it ever deserved. Instead of treating it as folklore, people have treated it as history. So instead of seeing it as a cultural artifact, they've seen it as divine truth. And that shift has had enormous consequences. It has shaped gender roles, reinforced inequality, justified suffering, and distorted how people understand the natural world. Even today, you can see echoes of Genesis 2 in debates about gender equality, in resistance to science, in attitudes toward the environment. The myth might be ancient, but its influence is still alive. And the only way to loosen that influence is to see the story for what it is, a myth, not a manual, a tale, not a truth. When you strip away the sacred aura, Genesis 2 doesn't explain human origins. It doesn't solve the problem of suffering. It doesn't offer a just moral framework. What it offers is a window into how ancient people thought and how they passed those thoughts on in story form. And once you see that clearly, you no longer need to carry its burdens. You don't need to accept guilt for existing. You don't need to accept inequality as natural. You don't need to accept obedience as the highest virtue. What you're left with is freedom. Freedom to see humanity as part of the natural world, not separate from it. Freedom to see knowledge as a gift, not a curse. Freedom to build morality on empathy, fairness, and reason, not on arbitrary rules. And freedom to shape relationships, families, and societies in ways that are just and equal, rather than in ways dictated by an ancient hierarchy. Genesis 2 may still be read, quoted, and preached, but once you've seen its contradictions, its flaws, and its consequences, you realize it has more to teach us as an artifact than as a guide. It tells us about the past, not about the truth of existence. And with that recognition comes a new perspective, one where we no longer need to defend myths, but instead face reality with open eyes. The Garden of Eden, in the end, was never lost, because it never existed. What exists is the world we live in now, imperfect, fragile, but real, and that world, not a mythical paradise, is where our responsibility lies.